I have written 17 longitudinal studies over the course of my career at the Oregon Institute of Sentient Biology. 17. Each one required a minimum of 2 years of continuous observation, a dedicated monitoring suite, and a subject whose cooperation I had either earned, or, in the case of the non-voluntary specimens, managed through sedation scheduling and careful restraint protocols. I have studied the hibernation patterns of VETH deep sleepers. Neural shutdown is so complete that even the autonomic systems flatline for weeks at a time. A full biological silence that the VETH themselves describe, when they wake, as a gap in their personal history, a door that closes and opens, and between those two events, there is simply nothing. I have tracked the micro-sleep cycles of the Dureth swarm mind, which does not sleep as individuals, but coordinates a rolling blackout across its collective nodes that mimics sleep function at the group level, each node surrendering awareness in sequence, while the adjacent nodes hold the watch. I have mapped the dormancy chemistry of 6 species across 4 phyla, and in every case, the data behaved. It obeyed the rules. Every sentient species we had ever cataloged, everyone, required a period of full neural dormancy to survive. Not reduced function, not diminished awareness, full dormancy. The nervous system's requirement for a complete shutdown cycle is not a preference or an evolutionary quirk. It is a structural biological fact, as non-negotiable as the requirement for oxygenated blood chemistry or adequate caloric intake. Without full dormancy, the neural tissue accumulates metabolic byproduct at a rate the waking repair mechanisms cannot clear. You can fight it. You can suppress the onset, chemically, with stimulants, with behavioral conditioning, even with certain forms of electromagnetic stimulation that trick the brain's stem into holding the wake state a few hours past its natural ceiling. The ceiling exists, and when you hit it, the system fails in predictable, measurable, irreversible ways. Cognition goes first, decision-making, spatial orientation, fine motor control. Then the deeper systems begin to slip. Then the organism dies. We knew this. We had proven it in clinical conditions, across multiple species with consistent and reproducible results. It was not a hypothesis. It was the kind of foundational fact upon which you build an entire field. I want to be clear about that before I explain what happened with the human. I want you to understand that, when I write that the data behaved, every other species, I mean that as more than a professional observation. I mean it as the baseline expectation of my entire scientific worldview. Data behaved. Biology obeyed. And when you have spent 31 years watching biology obey, you develop a particular kind of confidence, not arrogance. I want to be precise about the distinction. A grounded, evidence-based trust in the framework you have spent your professional life building. I had never needed to question that framework. I had occasionally revised the parameters within it, refined the measurements, updated the models with new data from new species. But the foundation itself, the dormancy requirement, the shutdown rule, the simple and well-proven fact that every brain eventually had to stop and be cleaned, that had never wavered. Not until the 4th day of the 3rd seasonal cycle, when Cale Riordan walked into the Oregon Institute and agreed to sleep in our monitoring suite. The bilateral research agreement that had brought him here had taken the diplomatic office approximately 8 months to finalize. The Institute had requested a human volunteer for a comparative sleep architecture study, a standard entry in the long-term comparative biology program, and the human diplomatic mission had identified Cale Riordan as willing. He was 43 years old by his own species reckoning, placed him, according to the comparative age tables the xenobiology department had assembled, somewhere in the broad middle of human adulthood. Not young, not elderly. What the humans themselves apparently describe as middle-aged, with the implication that significant physiological decline has not yet set in. He was of average height for a human male, slightly heavier than the median the pre-study literature described, with graying hair at the temples, and a quietness about him that I initially attributed to unfamiliarity with his surroundings. He did not seem nervous. That was the first thing I noted in my intake summary. Most voluntary subjects display some measurable physiological indicator of anxiety during intake. Elevated heart rate, cortisol spike, increased blink rate, changes in postural rigidity. Even species accustomed to clinical environments, show some baseline stress response during the initial observation period. It is a normal reaction to an unfamiliar setting, unfamiliar examiners, and the knowledge that you are going to be monitored continuously for an extended period of time. The Oregon Institute's long-term observation wing is a clean, well-lit, carefully climate-controlled environment, and we make every effort to ensure that subjects are comfortable and informed about the protocols in advance. Comfortable and informed does not mean unaffected. And in 31 years, I had seen exactly one subject arrive at intake with heart rate and sol levels indistinguishable from their baseline resting state. Cale Riordan was the second. I noted it. I flagged it in the intake summary as a point of interest, possibly indicating high familiarity with medical environments, an unusually well-regulated stress response, or simply an individual whose baseline was pitched low. It did not alarm me. It did not suggest anything beyond a minor curiosity about this particular subject's temperament. I assigned him to Suite 7 in the observation wing, walked him through the biometric sensor array that he would wear during his stay, explained through the translation interface what each sensor monitored and why, answered the questions he asked, which were thoughtful, calm, precisely worded, and left him to settle in for the night. He asked, near the end of the intake session, what specifically we were looking for. I explained that the study was comparative in nature. We were building a reference dataset for human sleep architecture to place alongside the equivalent datasets we had assembled for other species, and that the goal was a clean baseline, not a test in any evaluative sense. He nodded and said that made sense, and asked whether there was anything he should do differently during the sleep period. Whether he should try to sleep more or less, or at a particular time. I said no, he should simply sleep as he normally slept. Whatever was natural for him, he said. All right. He said it in the easy way of someone agreeing to an unimportant thing. The night cycle in Suite 7 runs 8 hours. We configure it to the dominant light cycle preference of the subject species. For humans means a standard solar day rhythm. Illumination for approximately 16 hours. Darkness for 8. The literature we had been given on human sleep biology was extensive and internally consistent. Adult humans require between 7 and 9 hours of consolidated sleep per 24-hour period, during which neural activity reduces to a characteristic low-frequency wave pattern. The body temperature drops by approximately 1 degree, and the autonomic repair functions that maintain neural tissue integrity run at peak efficiency. Missing a night was survivable. Missing several nights in succession was dangerous. Missing enough nights in succession was fatal. The literature was clear, well-sourced, and consistent with every principle of neurobiology we had established across all other species. I went home. My research assistant, Pravette, the overnight monitoring shift. The report was on my desk when I arrived the following morning. Pravette had flagged it as a Level 2 anomaly, which in our institute's coding system means data outside expected parameters, no immediate risk to subject, requires researcher review before the next session. Level 2 is common during intake weeks. Subjects often show atypical readings during the adjustment period which we account for in our methodology. I expected to read about an elevated heart rate, or an unusual cortisol pattern, or perhaps a disrupted first sleep cycle consistent with what the human literature called adaptation insomnia, a well-documented phenomenon in unfamiliar sleeping environments. These things are normal. I have seen them hundreds of times. What the report described was not normal. According to the biometric array, Cale Riordan had entered the suite's sleeping period. Lights dimmed at the standard onset time, temperature adjusted to the preferred range, ambient sound reduced to below the auditory threshold. The sensors had registered a slight decrease in his heart rate and a modest reduction in skin ductance, consistent with the early onset of the rest state. His body temperature had dropped approximately half a degree, and then, instead of proceeding to full neural dormancy, his brain activity had simply adjusted, reduced, reorganized itself into a pattern that Pravette's analysis flagged as unlike anything in the Institute's comparative neural database. It was not wakefulness. The wave pattern was too slow, too rhythmically organized for active cognition, but it was not sleep, not as we understood sleep, not as any species we had studied slept. The high-frequency cortical activity had not switched off. It had dimmed, distributed itself across a wider network, and continued running at low intensity in a pattern that cycled approximately every 90 minutes through a brief period of deeper reduction before rising again. Over the 8-hour sleep window, this cycle repeated 5 times. At no point did Cale Reardon's neural activity reach what any of our reference models would classify as full dormancy. He had not slept by any biological definition we possessed. And yet, when I entered Suite 7 the following morning, he was sitting at the small writing surface near the window, a cup of the hot liquid that humans call coffee, which we had arranged to have stocked per the comfort provisions in the agreement, and reading something on the small flat screen he had brought with him. He looked up when I came in and said good morning, for what the translation interface rendered as its approximate equivalent, and asked if the readings had come through clearly, because he had been aware of some sensor drift, the sounds and hour that he thought might have produced artifact in the data. I told him the readings had come through clearly. He nodded as if this was entirely unremarkable and returned to his reading. I went back to my office and read Prevet's report 3 more times. Then I called in my full research team. There were 4 of us on the longitudinal study. Myself as lead researcher, Prevet as monitoring specialist, Davon Orek as the Institute's comparative neurologist, and a young researcher named Sulith, who had joined us from the xenobiology division on a 6-month rotation and who had at that point been with us for approximately 3 weeks. I laid the overnight data on the shared display and walked them through it without editorial comment. I wanted their unprimed reactions. Prevet, who had already spent the night with it, sat with his arms crossed and said nothing. Davon Orek leaned forward and asked if the sensor array had been calibrated correctly before installation. I told him it had been calibrated twice, once by Prevet and once by the Institute's equipment division, and that the calibration logs were attached to the report. He asked if there was any possibility of signal contamination from the building's own monitoring infrastructure. I told him we had isolated Suite 7's array on a dedicated signal channel, as we did for all long-term subjects, and that the isolation protocols were also in the report. He sat back and looked at the display for a long time. Then he said, very carefully, that he would like to run the analysis again himself using the raw sensor data, and that he would have his results by end of day. Sulith, the youngest of us, who had been staring at the wave pattern graphics since I put it up, said, "Is the subject all right?" I told her the subject was, as far as we could determine, entirely fine. He had eaten breakfast, drunk his coffee, and was reading something on his personal screen. His heart rate was 62 beats per minute. His cortisol was in the lower third of his species' resting range. His motor function showed no impairment. His speech, during our brief interaction, had been coherent and precisely phrased. By every observable behavioral metric, he was indistinguishable from a rested human who had slept his full 8 hours. Sulith said, "But he didn't sleep," I said. "That appears to be correct." She stared at the display for another long moment and then said, more quietly, "That's not possible." I told her that I was aware it was not possible. I told her that we would observe another full night cycle before drawing any conclusions, and that in the meantime, I would review the existing literature on human sleep biology to determine whether there was any documented variant of human sleep architecture that might produce this pattern. I kept my voice even. I was a senior researcher at one of the foremost biological institutes in the explored territories. I had seen anomalous data before. The appropriate response to anomalous data is methodical re-examination, not alarm. I spent the rest of that day in the literature. I did not find what I was looking for. The human sleep literature, which was substantial, well-organized, used by researchers who were clearly rigorous, was consistent on every relevant point. Full neural dormancy was required. There were documented variations in sleep architecture, including individual differences in cycle timing, depth preference, and sensitivity to environmental disruption. There were pathological conditions that fragmented or disrupted sleep, and in every case the literature described the health consequences in terms that aligned precisely with our own neurobiological models: impairment, metabolic disruption, immune suppression, and with sufficient severity and duration, death. There were a handful of documented cases of individuals who claimed to require less sleep than average, but the literature treated these with appropriate clinical skepticism. And in the cases where such individuals had been studied directly, the data showed that while their self-reported sleep need was lower, they were still achieving full or near full neural dormancy. They were short sleepers, not non-sleepers. They still crossed the threshold. What I also found, and what I had not specifically gone looking for, was a body of human folklore and historical record around what they called staying up, being awake through the night, keeping watch. The humans had an extensive tradition of individuals and groups who maintained wakefulness across entire nights. Soldiers on guard duty, sailors on watch, parents with sick children, scholars working under deadline. The literature noted this with the clinical disapproval appropriate to a pathological behavior. Extended wakefulness degrades performance, it said, and humans know this. And they do it anyway because conditions sometimes require it. I read several passages in which human researchers documented the cognitive costs of these patterns with evident concern. And then I put the literature down and I sat with the following thought. The humans had been studying themselves for a very long time. They were not unintelligent. They understood their own biology at a sophisticated level. And they had written extensively about the dangers of not sleeping properly. It had simply never occurred to them that what they were doing when they slept was not, by the standards of any other species, sleeping at all. The second night produced identical data, the third night as well. By the end of the first week, Devon Orek had run the raw sensor data through 4 independent analysis methods and confirmed that the readings were accurate, the signal was clean, and the wave pattern was not an artifact. He delivered this finding in a brief written note that he placed on my desk without additional comment. I found it when I arrived in the morning. It was 2 paragraphs long. The second paragraph said simply, "I do not have an explanation for this." Devon Orek had been a comparative neurologist for 26 years. In my experience, Devon Orek always had an explanation for things. I began conducting brief morning interviews with the subject. Not formal sessions. I did not want to introduce protocol variables during the observation period, but casual conversational exchanges conducted through the translation interface, during which I asked Cale Riordan how he was feeling, how he had found the night, whether anything in the suite's environment was uncomfortable for him. He was consistently cooperative, consistently coherent, and consistently untroubled. He slept, he told me, like he always slept. He had always been a light sleeper, he said, meaning, and the translation interface flagged this as a culturally variable idiom, that he did not sleep deeply, that he was easily woken, that he rarely felt fully unconscious in the way some people described. He said he had never been one of those who fell into sleep, like falling into a hole and came out the other side 8 hours later. For him, sleep had always felt more like a dimming. Things quieted, his body settled, and then, at some point, the light came back and he was awake. And he could not have told you precisely where the boundary was. I asked him whether he woke frequently during the night. He thought about this and said, yes, usually 2 or 3 times, sometimes more. He said this as though it were unremarkable, the kind of thing a person mentions without concern, because it has never caused them concern. He said he always fell back to sleep within a few minutes, or what felt like a few minutes. Sometimes he was not sure if he had been fully awake or only partially awake in between cycles. I asked him whether he felt rested in the mornings. He said, yes, usually, not always. Sometimes he felt a little stiff or a little slow at the start of the day. But he had always been that way, he said. Some people were morning people, and he had never been one. But once he was moving, once he had his coffee, he was fine. I asked him whether he had ever gone without sleep for an extended period. He looked at me with an expression the translation interface flagged as mildly amused and said, sure, everyone has done that. He said he had done it during particularly demanding periods of his work, or when traveling across time zones, or when his children were small and he had done shift-style nighttime care. He said the longest he had gone without any sleep at all was probably 52 or 53 hours, during a crisis at his former workplace that had required continuous attention. He said by the end of that he had been tired but functional, and that he had slept heavily afterward. Meaning, he clarified, more deeply than usual, for a longer stretch than usual. I asked him, "How do you define heavily? What does that feel like?" He considered this for a moment and then said, "You know when you come in from cold weather, you get warm, and the warmth sort of presses you down. It felt like that. Like something was pressing him down and he did not fight it." I said, "Even then, even in that deeper state afterward, do you feel as though you have fully stopped? Do you feel as though you are not there?" He thought about this longer than he had thought about any of my other questions. Then he said, "Not really. Even then I hear things. I know if someone comes into the room. It's just that I don't care enough to respond. It's—" He paused, looking for the right words. "It's like the volume is turned all the way down, but the set is still on." I thanked him for the conversation and returned to my office and sat at my desk for a long time without opening anything. After 2 weeks, I formally escalated the study to Institute oversight. This is a procedural designation that triggers a secondary review of ongoing research that has produced data the lead researcher believes warrants institutional-level attention. In 31 years, I had triggered it twice before. Once for a specimen displaying unexplained regenerative capacity in a tissue sample, which turned out to be contamination, and once for a metabolic reading in a VETH deep sleeper that turned out to be an equipment failure. Both times, the secondary review had produced a mundane explanation, and I had filed the amendment and moved on. I was not confident that would happen this time. The Oversight Board requested a full data package, which I provided. 4 weeks of continuous biometric data, Davin-Orek's independent analysis, my interview transcripts with the subject, and my own preliminary notes. The board assigned a review committee of 5 members, was the maximum they assembled for non-emergency escalations, and scheduled a formal review session for the following week. In the meantime, subject continued to not sleep correctly and to be entirely fine about it. By the 4th week, we had added 2 additional measurement protocols to the suite's sensor array. The first was a high-resolution cognitive assessment battery that K.L. Riordan completed each morning and each evening, consisting of a standard attention and working memory task, a spatial reasoning component, a reaction time measure, and a brief verbal processing exercise. The battery was designed to be sensitive enough to detect the early-stage cognitive effects of sleep disruption, the kind of mild impairment that accumulates gradually and that subjects often fail to notice in themselves until it has become severe. Every study I had ever run on sleep-disrupted subjects had produced a visible degradation curve within the first 2 weeks. Subtle initially, significant by week 4, alarming by week 8. His scores were consistent across every session. Morning scores and evening scores showed a pattern of mild evening elevation in spatial tasks and mild morning elevation in verbal processing, which is a pattern we had seen in other species, and which our models described as a normal feature of daily cognitive cycling, not a sign of impairment. There was no degradation over time. There was no within-week decline. 4 scores were indistinguishable from week 1 scores. The second additional protocol was a tissue biopsy panel, with K.L. Riordan's consent, which he gave without hesitation or apparent concern. We collected a small sample of neural adjacent tissue, not from the central nervous system, directly, but peripheral neural structures, accessible without invasive procedure, and examined it for the metabolic markers that accumulate sleep deprivation in every species we had studied. The byproduct compounds that the sleep cycle cleanup mechanisms are responsible for clearing. The markers that, in any other organism, would begin to appear within the first 48 hours of sleep disruption and would escalate continuously with each subsequent disrupted night until the tissue showed measurable degradation. The markers were not elevated, not slightly elevated, not marginally elevated with a within normal range qualifier, not elevated in a way that would require a second opinion or a controlled comparison. They were normal. They were exactly where they would be expected to be in a well-rested individual who had been sleeping full and complete dormancy cycles for the duration of the study period. I sent the biopsy results to Davin-Orek. He came to my office in person, which he rarely did. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then came in and sat down, And we looked at each other across my desk, and then he said, "Pair functions running." I said, "Yes," he said. While he's awake, I said, "Not quite awake. The dimming state. The cycling state. Whatever we call it." He said, "Whatever we call it, it's doing what sleep is supposed to do. The cleanup is happening. Tissue maintenance is happening. The metabolic clearance is happening. While he is not fully conscious, not fully unconscious. Whatever that state is, the repair is running." I said, "Yes," he said. "That should not be possible," I said. "I am aware," he said. "Cleanup mechanisms require full dormancy to run efficiently. We have established this. We have replicated it across multiple species, multiple phyla. It is not a hypothesis. It is a demonstrated biological fact," I said. "I know what we established." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Unless the efficiency requirement is a function of the depth of dormancy, and some species can run the cleanup at lower dormancy depth, if the cycling is frequent enough to compensate. Frequent short dips rather than one sustained plunge. Less depth per cycle, more cycles per night. Equivalent total maintenance." I said I had considered that. He said, "Does the literature support it?" I said, "There is nothing in the literature about this. There is nothing in any literature I have been able to find that describes an organism doing what this subject is doing." We sat with that for a while. Then Devon said, "We should look at the cycling carefully, the 90-minute rhythm. If the cleanup is running in bursts during the deep point of each cycle, rather than as a sustained process the way it runs in full dormancy, that would explain the tissue results. Short but efficient bursts, repeated 5 or 6 times through the night. Additive efficiency. It would mean the repair function has been distributed and miniaturized, the way a distributed power grid carries the same total load as a central plant, just spread across more nodes." I told him I would add that analysis to the protocol. He stood up to leave, and then stopped at the door and said, without turning around, "How old did you say the subject is?" I said, 43, he said. "Humans live longer than that, yes. That is not old for them," I said. "The literature suggests a natural lifespan in the range of 70 to 90 years, with significant variability. 43 is middle adulthood, significant physical and cognitive capacity remaining," he said. "And he has been doing this, the cycling, the not fully shutting down his whole life, not just here, at home. This is his normal sleep," I said. "That appears to be correct." He nodded very slowly and left. He did not turn around again. The Oversight Board review session was held in the Institute's primary convening chamber on the 31st day of the study. The board had requested that I present the full longitudinal data in person, and that the subject be present for a brief question period if he was willing. Cale Riordan agreed to attend when I asked him, with the same equanimity he had shown throughout the study. He said he was happy to answer any questions they had. He said he was curious what they had found, actually. He said nobody had ever run this kind of monitoring on him before, and he would be interested to see what the data looked like. There were 8 people in the room when we began. The 5-member review committee, myself, Davin Orek as my representative neurologist, and the Institute's research director, Merev Isath, who had asked to observe. Merev had been the research director for 12 years. She was not a person given to visible alarm. I presented the data in the format I had prepared. Baseline intake readings, the full 6-week biometric record, the daily cognitive assessment results, the biopsy panel findings, Davin Orek's independent neurological analysis. I took no editorial position while presenting it. I described what the sensors had recorded. I described what the tissue analysis had shown. I described what the cognitive assessments had shown. I laid the data on the display, and I let it speak. It took approximately 40 minutes to walk through the full dataset. When I finished, the room was quiet for long enough that I became aware of the ventilation sound, which I normally do not notice. The committee chair, a senior biologist named Teneth Orev, who had been on the Institute's board for 19 years, said, "You are telling us that this organism has not achieved full neural dormancy in 6 weeks of continuous observation," I said. "That is correct," he said. "The tissue shows no evidence of the accumulation we would expect under those conditions," I said. "That is also correct," he said. "And the cognitive assessments show no impairment," I said. "Correct," he said. "And this is, apparently, his normal pattern. He has always slept this way," I said. That is what he reports, and the data is consistent with that account. There is no evidence of adaptation, no evidence of a compensatory pattern developing in response to the observation environment, no evidence of a pre-study period of full dormancy that would have loaded his tissue reserves prior to arrival. Tissue markers are consistent with this being his normal ongoing state, not a temporary adjustment. Kenneth Orev looked at the data display for a long time. Then he looked at Kale Riordan, who was sitting in a chair to one side of the room, in the posture of someone who is relaxed and mildly interested. Was exactly how he had looked during every session, every interview, every morning check, for 6 weeks. He said to the subject, "May I ask you a question directly?" Kale Riordan said, "Please." Kenneth said, "Do you ever feel tired?" Kale Riordan considered this with apparent seriousness, as though it were a question that deserved a thoughtful answer, rather than a casual one. Then he said, "Yes. Sometimes in the afternoon, especially if I have had a large meal or if I have been doing something that required a lot of concentration for a long stretch. Sometimes in the evenings before the sleep cycle starts, and occasionally in the mornings. First hour before the coffee takes effect." Kenneth said, "But you function." Kale said, "Yes, I function." Kenneth said, "This, the tiredness, the not quite resting fully. This has been your whole life," Kale said. "As far as I know. I never thought of it as unusual. My wife says I talk in my sleep sometimes. My understanding is that's common enough." Kenneth looked at him for a moment longer and then looked at me. I had nothing to add. There was a brief consultation among the committee members that I was not party to. They turned away and spoke in low voices, approximately 2 minutes. When Kenneth turned back, he said, "We will be requesting an expanded study. We would like to extend the observation period, if the subject is willing, and we would like to add a larger team with expertise in the specific cellular mechanisms involved." I said I would discuss the extension with Kale Riordan, and that the subject's willingness was, of course, the determining factor. Kenneth nodded and then paused and said, "Dr. Saroon, in your professional opinion, this pattern, the incomplete dormancy, the distributed cycling, the ongoing repair function, is this a pathology? Is there something wrong with this individual?" I thought about the question carefully. I thought about the 6 weeks of data, the normal tissue markers, the flat cognitive scores, week 1 matching week 6, the heart rate of 62 beats per minute every morning with his coffee, the expression of mild amusement when I asked him how he had slept. I said, "I cannot find evidence of pathology. The organism is functioning within normal parameters on every measure we can apply. Pattern is anomalous relative to our models, but the subject is not impaired. If this is a disorder, it is a disorder that has produced no detectable harm over 43 years of life." Kenneth said, "Then it may not be a disorder at all," I said. "That is the conclusion I have been reluctant to reach." He said, "Because if it is not a disorder," I said, "then this may simply be how humans sleep, or how some humans sleep, or conceivably how all humans sleep to varying degrees, and we have been misreading the human sleep literature. Because the literature was written by humans, about humans, and they have no reference point for comparison. They may not know that what they are doing is anomalous, because they have never had a reason to compare it to anything else. They have measured themselves against themselves for their entire scientific history. They have never had the chance to measure themselves against us." The room was quiet again. It was a different quiet from the first one. Less the quiet of people processing data, and more the quiet of people deciding how to respond to something they had not expected to feel. Marav Isath, the research director, who had not spoken during the entire session, said, "I want to make sure I understand the implication. You are suggesting that a species may have evolved, or developed, or adapted a sleep architecture that achieves the biological function of full dormancy without requiring full dormancy. That the cleanup, pair, the maintenance function runs in distributed short cycles of partial depth, rather than in a single long cycle of full shutdown." I said, "The data is consistent with that description." She said, "And this means they are never, not during any point in a given 24-hour cycle, fully offline." I said, "That appears to be correct," she said. "Even their rest state is a diminished wakefulness rather than a true shutdown." I said, "The wording I have been using internally is partial dormancy with distributed repair function." I am open to better terminology, she said. The wording is not the issue. I said, no. She said, the issue is that we are looking at a species that has never, 43 years, probably in its entire evolutionary history, been fully switched off, I said. In the individual sense, yes. At the neurological level, yes. She said nothing for a moment and then said, in a tone I would describe as professionally careful, that is a significant finding. I agreed that it was, she said. I would like this finding treated as restricted circulation until we have had time to complete the expanded study and verify the result across additional subjects. I would like to be very sure of what we are saying before we say it broadly. I agreed that this was appropriate. The session ended approximately 20 minutes later, after administrative discussion about the expanded study protocols. I walked Cale Reardon back to Suite 7, because it was on my way out, and the hour was late and I found myself, without having planned to, falling into step beside him. He asked how I thought the meeting had gone. I said I thought it had been productive, he said. They seemed surprised. The data has surprised all of us, he said. I'm not sure what you're seeing, but I hope it's useful to you. I've always been a light sleeper. It's just the way I am, I said. Yes, I think it is. He stopped at the door to his suite and looked at me with an expression that the translation interface flagged as friendly, but slightly puzzled, the look of a person who suspects they may have missed something, but cannot determine what it is. He said, is there something specific I should know? I considered the 6 weeks of data, the tissue markers, the cognitive scores, perfectly normal resting heart rate every morning, the repair function, running continuously, in a brain that had apparently never stopped running since the day it came online. I said, not at this time. We will share the full analysis with you as part of the study protocol. Get some rest, he said. I will. He went inside. The door closed. I stood in the corridor for a moment with my data pad under my arm and thought about the fact that rest for him was not what it was for me. For me, rest meant a full shutdown. 8 hours of genuine unconsciousness, during which the lights inside my neural architecture went off and the housekeeping staff came through and cleaned everything. And when I opened my eyes the next morning, I was, in a meaningful sense, briefly different version of myself. Refreshed, cleared, restarted. There was a version of me that existed before sleep and a version that existed after, and the gap between them was a real thing, a genuine discontinuity, a small death and small resurrection that happened every night without drama or recognition. I had never thought about it in those terms before. I thought about it now. For him, rest was a dimming, a quieting, a cycling through partial states of reduced awareness, each one shallow enough that he remained, in some functional, biological sense present, available, not fully gone. The housekeeping staff, as Davinorek's analysis would eventually confirm, did their work in short bursts, 40 minutes here, 40 minutes there, never requiring the full building to go dark. They cleaned room by room, wing by wing, while the rest of the building stayed on standby. And in the morning, the building opened as though it had never been closed, because it never truly had been. He had been like that his whole life. His species, in all likelihood, had been like that for as long as they had been a species. They had crossed oceans in wooden vessels, and built cities from raw stone, and gone to war across continents, and signed treaties and developed medicine and launched themselves into space and spread their presence across 100 systems. And through all of it, every night of every generation, the lights had never fully gone out. I am not a person who reaches for dramatic language. I have spent 31 years in clinical research. I traffic in data, in methodology, in the careful construction of defensible claims. When I write in this account that I stood in that corridor and felt something that my professional vocabulary does not have a precise term for. Not fear, not awe in the loose sense, but something structured and cold and specific, like watching a foundational principle of your field fail to apply to the thing in front of you. I want you to understand that I am not embellishing. I am describing, as precisely as I can, a sensation I have experienced only once in 31 years of clinical science, and which I would not attempt to describe at all if I did not believe it to be scientifically relevant. The final entry in my longitudinal study report, filed 14 months later after the expanded study had been completed and verified, reads as follows. The human subject demonstrates a sleep architecture that achieves the biological maintenance functions of full neural dormancy, pattern of distributed partial depth cycling, with no observed analog in any previously studied sentient species. Neural repair mechanisms operate during this cycling state at efficiency levels sufficient to prevent metabolic byproduct accumulation and maintain neural tissue integrity indefinitely. The subject displays no cognitive impairment attributable to sleep architecture across all measures applied, the study period. The pattern is consistent with the subject's self-reported lifelong experience and is corroborated by tissue analysis, indicating no accumulated deficit. The expanded study, conducted across a sample of 12 additional human subjects of varied age, sex, physiological profile, found the same architecture in 11 of 12 subjects, with the 12th displaying a variant that achieved full dormancy but did so in 2 shorter consolidated segments, rather than 1 extended cycle. The overall finding is that human sleep architecture is structurally distinct from that of all other studied species in 1 critical dimension. At no point during the human rest state does neural activity reach 0. Human brains do not switch off. They cycle, they dim and rise and dim again, and the repair function runs throughout. And in the morning the human opens its eyes, and there is no seam, no restart, no reboot. Just a continuation of a process that never fully stopped. The implications of this finding for threat assessment modeling are outside the scope of this study. I have flagged this report to the appropriate departments and note only, as a factual matter, that the sleep deprivation vulnerability we have historically included in our biological assessments of human operational limits may require significant revision. I recommended, in my final note to Marav Isath, that the Institute consider reaching out to additional human research partners regarding further study. She approved the recommendation. She also, separately, requested that the threat assessment flag be elevated to the Joint Intelligence and Security Committee was not something she had in response to any previous research finding in my memory. I asked her assistant what the escalation category was. The assistant told me it had been filed under sustained operational endurance, which is a category I had not previously seen used in the Institute's internal routing system. It had been created, the assistant informed me, approximately 3 weeks earlier, following a separate incident in a different department that I was not briefed on. I did not ask further. When I asked Marav directly, in a brief conversation in the corridor outside her office, why she had escalated, she said, because there is a difference between studying a species that can survive difficult conditions and studying a species that cannot be reliably put to rest. The first is interesting. The second is something else. I asked her what the second was. I filed my report. I closed the study. I went home that night for the first time in years. I found myself lying in the dark thinking about the light I had seen on in Suite 7 at 2 in the morning on the 7th day of the study when I had come back to the building for something I had forgotten. The monitors in my office could show the biometric feeds from every suite, and I had checked Kale Riordan's automatically, the way you check a thing you have been watching for a long time, and his wave pattern had been doing what it always did. Cycling, dimming, rising, and the light in his suite, the small lamp he kept on at the desk, was still on, and I could see on the low-resolution suite camera that he was sitting at the writing surface, not quite still, shifting slightly in the way a person shifts when they are in a particular state between waking and something else. Not asleep, not awake, running. I turned off my monitor and went home. I did not note it in the report. It did not change the data, but I have thought about it often since. The small lamp, the slight movement, the wave pattern cycling through its 40-minute depth and back up again, the repair function doing its work, the brain that had never gone dark continuing to not go dark. He had told me, in that first week, that sleep for him felt like a dimming. Believe him. I believe that is what it is for a human. A dimming, not an ending. A reduction, not a stop. The volume turned down, not the power cut. And when you turn the volume back up in the morning, you do not need to wait for the system to boot, because the system was never off. It was simply quiet. It was simply running at low, tending itself, maintaining itself, cycling through the dark with no fanfare and no disruption, the way a river runs at night, Lower, slower, calmer, but still a river, still moving, still there. I have come to believe, in the measured, evidence way that I believe anything, that this is not a flaw in human biology, not a disorder they have carried without knowing it, not a gap in their architecture that they have compensated for through behavioral adaptation. Every species has gaps. Every species has workarounds. This is not that. This is a design choice that evolution made a very long time ago, and it has held, and it works. And none of them have ever had a reason to question it, because none of them have ever had anything to compare themselves to. They do not go offline because they were never designed to go offline. They dim, they cycle, they run their maintenance in the quiet. And in the morning, they pick up exactly where they left off, because they never actually put it down. I have 17 longitudinal studies behind me. The human study is the 18th. It is the only one that required me to revise what I thought I knew about what was possible. It will not be the last revision. I am already certain of that. We have barely begun. We have one species and 14 subjects and a finding that has been in the restricted circulation file for 14 months. And already I know that the models we use to assess what humans can sustain, how long they can operate, how deeply they can be degraded, at what point they stop functioning and require recovery. Well, those models were built on a false assumption. The assumption that they sleep the way we sleep. The assumption that they switch off. They do not switch off. We have a great deal more to learn about what humans can do when you are not watching them. And, more to the point, what they can keep doing when everything around them has gone still.